look, let me first of all just say something about why it is important to have a meeting on how history works, which in a sense is what this meeting is about at this moment in time. We are living in historic times. We are living in a period of crisis which is on the same scale as the 1930s. And when you enter a period of profound economic, social and political crisis like the present, history comes to a turning point, and it can go in different directions. In the 1930s, history could have gone towards socialist revolution and a transformation of the world. It could. It was close in Spain, for example, in 1936, 1937. There was a wave of radicalization across Europe. It could have gone in that direction in the 1930s, but it didn't. And because it didn't in the 1930s, fascism was victorious, and the decade ended with the 1940s and with Stalingrad, Auschwitz and Hiroshima. But that was not inevitable. That final outcome of the crisis last time was not inevitable. It depends on what people do. History is not predetermined. And the reason why we have a meeting now about how history works is because we need to get a sense of that relationship which there is between agency and structure, by which I mean that history is not completely open, in that we make history in certain conditions, in certain circumstances, in the actual situation in which we find ourselves. So there are limited options, not endlessly open options. But it is us that makes history. There is agency. History can go in different directions depending on what tens of thousands and then hundreds of thousands and then millions of people actually do. What we do, and thousands of others like us, can mean that there is a different outcome to the crisis this time than there was in the 1930s. Now, I'm going to try and get to grips with this process of how history works by talking about the three great transformations in human history, and to talk also about how those transformations were brought about as a result of the action and the interaction of three different engines of history, which I'm going to call them. Now, I can't do the whole of, it's called A Brief History of the World, but in actual fact I can't do the whole thing in half an hour, so I'm going to only do the last 10,000 years. However, I'm going to do a very quick summary of the 2.5 million years before then, and I have two, because I'm an archaeologist, I have two objects representing the beginning of time, and not the end of time, but our time, present time. So on the right is a Paleolithic hand axe. Now that Paleolithic hand axe, it could be 2.5 million years old, or it could be 500,000 years old, or 400,000 years old, or 350,000 years old, we're not quite sure. And what that proves is that progress is not inevitable, because they were making them like that 2.5 million years ago, and they were still making them like that 2 million years later. Progress is not inevitable in the human record, and in a sense, my iconic objects representing present time are also a confirmation of that lesson, that progress is not inevitable. This is a Second World War gas mask with a Second World War first aid party helmet sitting on top, of the kind that would have been worn here. We're in the East End of London, the most heavily bombed part of London in 1940, of the kind that would have been worn here during the Blitz. That too is, or those two objects also remind us that progress is not inevitable, that we can go backwards, that there can be a descent into barbarism, even in the circumstances of the most highly developed societies such as our own. So that's the old Stone Age. I'm going to bring us forward to about 10,000 years ago. And let me indicate now what I think these three great transitions are. I'm going to talk about two of them in the first bite, as it were, and then I'm going to pause and give people an opportunity to come in, and then I'm going to do the third one afterwards. The three great transitions are these: the agricultural revolution, the urban revolution, it's a bad name, but I'll explain what it means in a moment, and the industrial revolution. Everything else is the froth of history. The agricultural revolution, the urban revolution, and the industrial revolution are the three great transformations that transform the whole of human social experience. The fourth is yet to come. The fourth would be, if we make it, the socialist revolution that turns the wealth of the industrial revolution into a means of satisfying human need by putting it under democratic control and subjecting it to collective human planning. But so far, we've passed through three great transitions. Let me start with the agricultural revolution. You see, the agricultural revolution, for those who made it, was bad news. It was bad news because, believe you me, it's much, much easier just to go out into nature and hunt what is already there and collect what is already there, to allow nature to provide that which you need to make a living. Agriculture is bloody hard work. Endless, back-breaking toil. Clearing the land of trees, or draining the land and keeping it so, and ploughing it and harrowing it and sowing it and weeding it and harvesting it and so on. So it only happens because there is pressure on the hunter-gatherer communities at the beginning of time. Almost certainly it's driven by climate change, by global warming, by desiccation, which has the effect of shrinking, of drying out and shrinking the natural vegetation of the landscape and shrinking the naturally occurring food supplies and forcing people to begin doing what they already knew was possible but hadn't done up until this point because it was too much like hard work, to begin to deliberately cultivate the soil, deliberately sow seeds, and to domesticate animals and to breed their own animals. That's the agricultural revolution, and it's a total and utter transformation in the whole of human social experience. It begins in certain parts of the world about 10,000 years ago. It doesn't reach some parts of the world until the 20th century. In fact, there are some communities, even today, that still have a hunter-gatherer existence. So the agricultural revolution is happening in different places at different times, and it reflects a contradiction between nature, which on the one hand provides us with the means of making a living, and our ability to extract that living from it. Nature can be unyielding. Nature can be a hard taskmaster, imposing heavy labour upon us if we're going to extract from it the things that we need. That contradiction, which is tightened in circumstances of global warming, desiccation, forces people to become farmers. Now, I'm going to say something very significant happens as a result of the agricultural revolution, and this is a key concept for Marxists trying to make sense of the past. It makes possible the creation of a surplus. It makes possible, because people are settled in one place, because people are investing their labour in making the land more productive, it becomes possible for them for the first time to actually generate a surplus. Not much at first, but a little bit more than is necessary just for basic survival. If you're a hunter-gatherer, you're moving around, and you can only carry what you can carry. And there's no point in generating a surplus. Hunter-gatherer communities don't generate a surplus for that reason. If you are living in a settled agricultural village, you have the capacity to generate a surplus. And as you begin to generate a surplus, there are interesting things that you can do with that surplus that are different from the things that you do if all you're doing is creating the means of subsistence, if all you're doing is creating just enough. You can see it very, very graphically in the archaeological record. We know when the agricultural revolution is happening in the archaeological record. If you go down to Salisbury Plain, there's a great big double ring of enormous great stones, Stonehenge, very famous megalithic monument. That is an example of both the agricultural revolution and the way in which the agricultural revolution makes it possible to generate a surplus. Because I tell you this, hauling those stones, those massive great stones into place, didn't produce anything. That is waste expenditure on a colossal scale for this society. That is the consumption of a surplus over and above the basic that we actually need in order to survive. And once you have such a surplus, it also becomes possible in relation to that surplus to begin to create a bit of a division of labour. A division between different groups of specialists. A division of labour between those whose main work is to produce and those whose job is possibly to perform the holy rituals that take place at Stonehenge. Those whose job it is possibly to organise the defence, the military defence of our land and our surpluses against those a short distance away who may be in hard times and may be interested in preying upon our success. You create the possibility, if you have a surplus over and above basic subsistence, you create the possibility of creating specialists. And the thing about specialists is you're giving them control over bits of the surplus. You're giving them control over religious ritual. You're giving them control over military organisation. You're giving them control over political organisation. You're giving them control over the social organisation and the way in which people are organised together for different activities. And it doesn't take very long for those who have such control over surplus to develop an interest in tightening their control over the surplus, because they'd rather be a priest or an officer or a politician or a chieftain or whatever. They'd rather be that than doing the back-breaking toil of working in the fields. And as that transition from specialists in control of surplus into a group of people who are then using surplus as a way of tightening their control over society, as that transition takes place, we move towards the second of our great transitions. And the second of our great transitions is the urban revolution. The urban revolution, it's a misnomer in my view, because it implies that it's inevitably to do with towns and cities, but that is a very, very clear archaeological marker that we have reached it. But what's fundamental to it is this, that there is the emergence on the basis of agricultural surpluses of ruling classes. That is, people who control surplus and use their position of control over surplus, A, to maintain their position, and B, to increase the amount of surplus which is being generated by the producing classes. And as class society emerges embryonically from agricultural society, and it is challenged by other forces, we then have our first class struggles. We have struggles developing between those who are, in a sense, usurping power over society and over society's surpluses, and those who are producing the surpluses and who will be resisting the degree to which the specialists are turning themselves into a ruling class. Now, in getting us this far, in talking about the agricultural revolution and the urban revolution, I have actually introduced these three motors of history that I said were fundamental to these processes of transition. The first is this. It is technological change. And this is, I'm going to sort of sum up with this and then take a pause. The three motors are these. The motor of technological change. The technological change which is represented, for example, in the shift from hunting-gathering into agriculture, but of course it's a transition which is happening again and again and again. And once humanity has made a major technological advance, and once that technological advance has been has been embedded in the experience and the practice of the common people, and by the common people I mean the people who do the work, the producing classes. Once that has happened, it is never forgotten. It becomes part of the steadily accumulating human store of knowledge, of technique, of skill, of wisdom, of know-how. We will never go back to the Paleolithic hand axe, because our heads are now full and our libraries are full and the internet is full of the accumulated knowledge of the last 10,000 years. Major productive innovations that become widespread among the producing classes represent one of those motors of historical change. Here's a second. It is that as we create a class society, as with the urban revolution, first of all in Egypt and in Mesopotamia and in the Indus Valley and in the Yellow River Valley of China, these are the places where it first happens. These are the places where cities are first constructed, round about 5,000 years ago. As that happens, we see two other motors beginning to operate. We see the motor of competition between ruling classes for control over surplus. So Mesopotamia is divided into 3000 BC. It's divided into lots of separate city-states controlling different territories. And the ruling classes that control the different cities are competing with each other. And because they are competing with each other, they're building states, they're building armies, and they're going to war. As soon as we have class society, we have a fractured ruling class, we have fragments of the ruling class competing for control over surplus, because that's fundamental to the existence of a ruling class. That it controls surplus, that it is competing for control of surplus, that it is necessarily, therefore, in conflict with other ruling classes. That motor operates then through the entire history of class society right up to the present. It's represented today in the growing conflict, for example, between declining American capitalism and rising Chinese capitalism. That's essentially a conflict between two dominant global ruling classes for control over economic resources, fundamentally when you boil it down to its essence. That's the second motor. The third motor is the class struggle. The third motor is that as soon as you create a class society where there is a ruling class creaming off surplus, using surplus in wasteful ways, using surplus to fight wars, using surplus to build pyramids, using surplus to build Greek temples, using surplus to build Roman amphitheatres. This is all waste expenditure. When you have ruling classes using surplus to fight wars, when that begins to happen in a competitive context, such that the ruling class is putting the squeeze all the time on the producing classes, the result is resistance. Resistance from those who are being exploited to generate the surpluses. And there is then built into all class society not just a struggle between different sections of the ruling class, but also a struggle between the exploiters and the exploited, between the ruling class and the subject class, whatever the nature of that subject class, whether the subject class is made up of slaves or serfs or peasants or workers, whatever, there is that conflict which is also part of the process of shaping history. 3 motors. That's enough to be going on with. Let's have some discussion.
Excellent, but I'm not entirely sure I agree that societies can't go backwards. I think societies do go backwards, and I think Walter Benjamin actually said there's no such thing as progress in history. He was polemicizing against both the sort of social democratic and Stalinist view of the world, everything onwards and forwards, and he said, actually, history is like a train which is hurtling towards self-destruction, and our job is to press the emergency chain in order to get off this bloody train. And if we don't get off the train, we're going to be destroyed. And I think it's a better way of looking at actually where we're at. Because I think we're in one of those moments where we are on a train, which is actually heading towards destruction of the planet and of humanity, unless we do something about it in terms of that. And the reason I say that is I think it goes back to something that Marx said, that the way that society is organised to produce things and to construct things, in the end becomes a barrier on the ability of societies to progress. And we see around the globe societies which have failed because of class interest of maintaining the existing status quo, failing to develop, and actually ending up going to destruction. You can mention Manchu China, actually, as an example of that. But I just want to give one example, which is in the Renaissance period, the Italian city-states and Bohemia, and indeed the what's called the Low Countries, where clearly capitalism was developing at the same time as a huge artistic outflowing. If you look at something like Florence, the real potential for capitalism, and I know it's hard for people to think this being a progressive idea, but capitalism in this sense was a step forward from feudalism, right? In terms of in terms of the potential for life and all the rest of it. And what happened there was that actually because of to be honest, the timidity of the bourgeoisie, the capitalist class that was emerging in places like Florence, they weren't able to carry it forward. And if you read Machiavelli's The Prince, it's actually about bewailing the fact there was no agency in order to carry through this transformation. He's literally looking for a prince to come and save the Florentine Republic in order for it not to be destroyed. He picks the unlikely pick of Cesare Borgia, who is never going to save him, but that's by the point. And also involved in that, there is another side to it. There is always a side of counter-revolution. And in that case, if you look back to the Renaissance period, the old order didn't stand there and watch. It intervened decisively to destroy the new societies which were emerging. They invaded Florence. They invaded Bohemia. They destroyed it. The Habsburgs, and all the rest of it intervened in this process. And I think when we take class struggle into it, there's a two-way thing here, and it comes back to agency. You know, we have choices. We always have choices, but there is nothing inevitable, which is why Marx said human beings make history, but we don't do so in the circumstances of our own choosing. In other words, we can make history, but we wouldn't start from here.
Okay, I'd accepted 2 other hands. Can you come forward? And also the man at the back. There were 2 hands I accepted before.
Yes, you mentioned the 3 revolutions, but without mentioning one that I think could be argued as sort of a more important revolution in human history and prehistory, and that's the transformation that actually created humanity with culture, language, all these things that make us rather different from other animals. In a sense, the shift from something like chimpanzees to something like to hunter-gatherers. And I think you can call that a social revolution. We don't know exactly what happened all those hundreds of thousands of years ago, but it must have been something like a social revolution if you just simply look at the way in which, say, chimpanzee society is organised with sort of alpha male dominance, very hierarchical sort of social order, whereas with simple hunter-gatherers, which obviously have been studied, the few societies that are left, and these are incredibly egalitarian, communistic social relationships where there's no property, no hierarchy. Marx himself was, of course, interested in primitive societies, and at one point actually says that such primitive societies had incomparably greater vitality than the modern societies, including capitalist societies. So I think, of course, the other revolutions you mentioned are extremely important, but I think perhaps the agricultural revolution is a bit more of a counter-revolution. I mean, you mentioned how unpleasant life was under agriculture in a class society. But I think the revolution that created humanity, that in a sense created a socialist, a communist, almost social relation out of what would have been probably a much more hierarchical relation, that seems like a much more interesting revolution that perhaps we could try and learn from and try and understand.
Thank you. And I'd like to give my thanks to Neil as well for the start of what was a very gripping talk, I thought. It's much less of a contribution and more of a question, and quite a specific question at that, relating to the spread of the agricultural revolution. And you mentioned that this occurs in waves, and that even in the 20th century there are still some societies which haven't or are only starting to undergo the agricultural revolution. And my question was, why, from your perspective, in my attempt to sort of understand this historical context a bit more, why do you think that these revolutions happen in waves? And how do you think they happen in waves? Do you think communities are inspired by other communities, or do you think they are revolutions which are sort of homegrown? So that's my question. Thank you.
I also wanted to pick up on this point about stagnation in certain class societies, because I think it's a very interesting debate, and it's something I'd like Neil to come back on, because capitalist society is increasingly a stagnant society, but in very specific and complicated ways. You can't deny, for example, many of the technological innovations in capitalist society over the last 10 or 20 years that have an enormously transformative effect on the way people live their lives, namely the internet, MP3, mobile phones, all that kind of stuff. At the same time, I think that modern British society is incredibly culturally degenerative. I think that's something that's obvious. It's obvious if you look at something like youth culture and music. Take Adele, right? Adele is an incredibly talented songwriter, an incredibly talented singer, but is her music new? No, it's not. It's a rehashing of a style of music really pioneered in the 50s and 60s and so on. And it's an excellent reiteration of that, but it's not a new form of music. In fact, I think you'd have to look in Britain back to punk as being the last truly new sort of youth culture, youth movement. There was an enormous explosion in youth culture in the 1960s. That I see as being a product of the enormous buoyancy of the world capitalist system. At the time, there was an enormous boom that lasted 20 odd years, and it empowered young people to an extent to make their own form of cultural expression. Since then, that generation's culture has been a sort of dead hand on ours, which is a very sort of peculiar formation, but it reminds me of the Byzantine Empire was a typically reactionary, degenerative society. The way in which it extracted a surplus meant that it never had enough to reinvest into productive methods, and the culture stagnated and just became constant reproduction of old forms of art, old forms of production, and things like that. I very much see capitalism as a society, sort of going in that direction. I just wonder if Neil could talk about that.
Okay, are there any more hands at this stage? Yeah, please come forward. Any more hands that I can take at the moment?
Yes, it was said at the beginning that people make their own history, but not under conditions of their choosing, meaning that we have the agency to sort of change history. But this does not harmonise well with the sort of tripartite division of history into three technological revolutions without understanding their corresponding class content. For instance, the Industrial Revolution, I think it was said very well by the first speaker, that although the bourgeoisie in Florence emerged first, they were unable to realise themselves politically, whereas in Britain this is very different. The bourgeoisie managed to conquer political power, and this is what carries forward the Industrial Revolution in Britain and allows Britain to transfer capitalism around the world. I think understanding history as a series of social revolutions gives us a much more productive view of the line of march for socialists today. For instance, when Karl Marx spoke of revolution as the locomotive of history, it didn't mean simply the development of productive forces. He meant class conflict, he meant social revolutions, and I think this gives us the strategy that we need to push forward today, and this is the conquest of political power by the working class that allows us to overturn capitalism and realise real substantive equality and not simply formal equality, and carry forward the means of the productive forces beyond simply what capitalism gives us, because everywhere under bourgeois rule these productive forces are hitting fetters, and this is broadly why capitalism enters these series of very destructive crises that impact working class people all around the world.
Okay, is there any further questions at this time? Please don't be shy. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to bring Neil back in now for another 10 minutes, during which time you'll have plenty of chance to think up some questions. We're going to have another 5 minutes of questions and then a brief sum up at the end from Neil.
Okay. I don't really think that Chris and I disagree at all. I mean, I think two things. There's a danger of muddling two things. I don't think that progress is inevitable. That was the very first thing that I said. What I do think is that technological changes, once they are embedded, become part of the general store of knowledge. Now, how those technological advances are used is then an open historical question. Let me give you a concrete example. In 1914, we had the beginning of what turned out to be the first modern industrialized war. At no point was that war fought with the weapons of the Napoleonic Wars. On the contrary, what the war did was to become a forging house for technological advances in the means of destruction, instead of the means of raising productivity and satisfying human needs. So there's a difference between technological advances and the productive capacity of humanity, which is a cumulative process, and the way in which those advances might be used. And they can be used in bad ways and in good ways. They can be used productively and they can be used destructively. They can be used to make the world better, or they can be used to plunge us into barbarism. And in a sense, I mean, I think we're probably all agreed, that is the nature of the choice that we perhaps face in the present period, just as it was faced in the 1930s. Let me say something about the point that was made about primitive communism as being a sort of very interesting idea to play with in relation to the past. I mean, I don't think that I was implying for a moment that this was not in fact the case, that in fact hunter-gatherer communities and early communities of the agricultural revolution were relatively egalitarian and democratic precisely because they produced either no surplus or only a very, very small surplus. And in fact, there was a process of change and struggle which gave rise to a situation where the surplus was concentrated in the hands of a minority, and that minority evolved into an exploiting class. So there is a shift from one state of being in terms of how society is organised to another, and it bears on the contribution of the last contribution that was made about the difference between, about not talking about social revolution. All of these revolutions are economic revolutions and social revolutions and political revolutions. They are completely transforming. I mean, the one that I'm going to talk about in a moment, the Industrial Revolution, involves both profound economic change and concomitant social change, and necessarily generates massive political conflicts. And the outcome of those political conflicts determines in which parts of the world, at what points in time, the Industrial Revolution takes off. And it's absolutely the case that you've got to examine very closely indeed the nature of the class struggle in late medieval and 16th and 17th century England. If you want to understand why it is in England, first of all, in a really large-scale way, that the Industrial Revolution takes off, that capitalism takes off. So the point about these three great transformations is precisely that they're not just technological, they're not just economic, they're also social and political. They are profound transformations in the nature of human experience. The last thing, just before I say some more about the Industrial Revolution, is I'm not sure how useful it is to compare us with the Byzantine Empire. Now, the reason I say that is not because I disagree with the basic observation that the capitalist system is and has been for a protracted period of time basically stagnant and historically redundant. I mean, I think that is true, but I do think the whole dynamic of capitalist society is profoundly different from the dynamic of pre-industrial society. And I'm just going to flesh that out a bit by saying something about cycles of time and arrows of time, which I think are quite useful organising concepts. All of our human experience is about both cycles, which essentially repeat, and arrows, which represent change and movement. All human experience has both aspects. We spend huge amounts of our time following essentially the same routines. That's still true in industrial society, and was even more true in traditional agricultural society. I mean, if you were a peasant in 11th century England, your experience was not that different from a peasant in 12th century England or 13th century. I mean, there were some changes, but the changes were absolutely minimal. Your life experience was absolutely dominated by the agricultural routine, just to provide the means in order to live. At the same time, there are processes of change going on, and sometimes those processes of change are very slow. The mold of history is working very, very slowly, and at other times those processes of change are extremely rapid. Now, characteristic of industrial capitalism is that the arrows of time, the speed of change, the fundamental nature of change to human experience just is qualitatively different from what has existed before. Marx, I'm going to actually quote Marx himself on this, because he is very eloquent about, in the Communist Manifesto, he's very eloquent about how fundamentally different bourgeois, capitalist, industrial society is compared with all previous class societies, all forms of ancient and medieval society. This is how he talks about its dynamism in the manifesto. The bourgeoisie cannot exist without constantly revolutionizing the instruments of production, and thereby the relations of production, and with them the whole relations of society. Conservation of the old modes of production in unaltered form was, on the contrary, the first condition of existence for all earlier industrial classes. That was the norm in traditional pre-capitalist society, he's saying. Constant revolutionizing of production, uninterrupted disturbance of all social conditions, everlasting uncertainty and agitation distinguish the bourgeois epoch from all earlier ones. All fixed, fast, frozen relations, with their train of ancient and venerable prejudices and opinions, are swept away. All new formed ones become antiquated before they can ossify. All that is solid melts into air. The point he's making is that absolutely characteristic of this system, which begins to take off economically around about 1750, absolutely fundamental to it is the fact that there has to be constant revolutionizing of the means of production. And here's why. Here's why it's so different. Up until this point in human history, competition between ruling classes has taken the form primarily of political and military competition. And that's because if you try and invest in order to raise the productivity of labour in new technology, the gains are so minimal that it isn't worth the effort in the competition against ruling classes who are investing instead in military power. So the principal way in which ancient and medieval ruling classes compete with each other is by investing surplus in military power. It's not in the improvement of technique. It's not in economic investment. What is fundamental to the nature of the Roman Empire is not slave plantations. What is fundamental to the Roman Empire is that it was a system of robbery with violence, in which the Roman ruling class invested the bulk of its surplus in the creation of a military machine. That military machine was used to conquer territory, to win booty, to steal surplus from other ruling classes by force. And that's how the system was built. That's how the Roman ruling class enriched itself. That's how the Roman state was built. It was a system of predatory military imperialism. What's fundamental to capitalism, what's fundamental to the Industrial Revolution, is that because of the economic takeoff, because there's an explosion of technique, the principal way in which members of the ruling class compete with each other now is economically. It's actually investing in the development of technique. It's investing in factories, it's investing in mines, it's investing in railways, it's investing in new machinery so that you can produce things more quickly, more cheaply, more efficiently, and you can outcompete your opponent. It's a system of economic competition rather than a system of political or military competition. And it means that history, which has been in, if you like, it's been in first gear at the time of the agricultural revolution, and then goes into second time of the urban revolution, is suddenly yanked into fifth gear. And everything is moving suddenly in history at tremendous speed. And those three motors that I talked about, the motor of technological change and the transformations that that brings about, the motor of the struggle between different classes, and the great conflicts, the great wars, the great world wars that brings about, and the struggle between social classes over the distribution of surplus, those three motors which interact with each other, which are intermeshed together, are all working in top gear. Where are we now? Well, they said a few years ago, how long have we got? I'll speak for another 3 or 4 minutes. Will that give us enough time for? Yeah, okay. They talked a few years ago about the end of history, of course, and what they meant when they talked about the end of history was that the end of history was the development of liberal capitalism, the triumph of the free market across the economy, linked with some kind of liberal bourgeois parliamentary system. We have to answer that now in this period of crisis by saying it's not about the end of history, it's not about some eternal neoliberal dystopia. It is about us again, the ordinary people, the common people, the mass of of humanity, intervening and organising and struggling in order to make history. We are at the end of a long, proud tradition of mass struggle from below. And that tradition of mass struggle from below has driven the historical process, has constantly transformed history, has constantly remade the world, and it is now our turn. It's now our turn to do that. It's now our turn to do what Spartacus did. It's now our turn to do what John Ball and the peasant rebels in medieval England did. It's now our turn to do what Oliver Cromwell and the Levellers did in the English Revolution. It's now our turn to do what the Chartists did, or what the people who built the new unions did. It's now our turn to organise ourselves into a mass movement capable of shaping history instead of being its victims. Okay, is that on? Yeah, it is, okay. Look, I don't know that we are being Eurocentric, really. I mean, in talking about the agricultural revolution started in Central Asia. In talking about the urban revolution, the four original centres of great civilizations that were based on a new kind of class society. Those four great centres were Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, which is now in Pakistan, and the Yellow River Valley in China. Those are the original centres of civilization. It's not Eurocentric to talk in those terms. What is true is that the Industrial Revolution started in Europe. Now that is simply factually correct. Specifically, it was in Britain that there was the original takeoff. Now it's worth saying why that is. It's because the ruling class in Britain, for all sorts of complicated historical reasons that we haven't got time to go into, was relatively weak compared with the ruling classes in Europe. And there was the space for the economic and social and political advance in Britain of other social forces that made a revolution. The revolution was made by those called in the 17th century the middling sort. The middling sort were Cromwell's Ironsides. The middling sort were the New Model Army. The middling sort were the Levellers, who were the first people to challenge the property-owning elite and to argue for the extension of democratic rights to the common people. In other words, the revolution was driven forwards from below in Britain, and that's what created the conditions for an economic takeoff in Britain in the course of the 18th century. Now, of course, what is happening is that the Industrial Revolution, capitalism has become absolutely general, and new centres of capital accumulation, new centres of industrialisation are rising extremely rapidly, and Europe is in relative decline. I mean, so you can't begin to understand the nature of the current crisis, particularly the crisis of the Eurozone, unless you put it into the context of a changing world economy where the balance of economic power is shifting away from Europe. So I don't think we are being Eurocentric in the way in which we're talking about these things. I think that was the substantive thing that was raised in the discussion. So I'll just close by saying this, really. I can be absolutely certain of one thing, and that is that history will happen. There will be a history of the next 10, 20, 30 years. That is certain. And if we let them, that history will be made by the ruling class, because they hold power. And we have to build mass movements from below to challenge that power if we are going to shape history and move it in a different direction. So what is happening today is not just about ideas. Ideas are important because we have to understand the historical process, we have to understand the situation in which we find ourselves now, but arising out of that understanding, there has to be strategy. There has to be a way forward. Specifically, we have to know what to do next, what to do immediately to build the kinds of movements that we need. So unashamedly, I will conclude this meeting by saying that if you want to get active, you need to join an organisation. And I think what we actually need is a network of revolutionary activists that want to tear the head off the ruling class. Not necessarily literally, but metaphorically speaking, to disempower the ruling class, to take control as a mass movement of ordinary people from below and create a system of democratic control over the banks, over business, over the economy, over how we run our society. And we need a network of revolutionaries to do that. And more concretely and immediately, we need a network of revolutionaries to build those mass movements that will make that possible, the coalition of resistance and the Stop the War movement in particular. So I would urge people, if you are in south of the border, to join Counterfire today and become part of such a network of activists rooted in mass movements and trying to build the mass movements and trying to shape history. If you are north of the border, then join the International Socialist Group.